So in this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about participles, and for reference, we're looking at Mastronarde's units 26 and to 28. So we already went over the forms of the participles, and now we're going to be looking at what they can be used for. But we'll do a quick overview of them. So the thing about participles is that they are part verb and part adjective. So in the part that makes them a verb is that they have tense, so they can be a present, future, aorist, or perfect, and they can also have voice. They can be active, middle passive, and passive. And on the adjective side, it's going to depend on a noun that's governing it. So it's going to have case, gender, a number that it gets from this other noun or pronoun. And it'll also behave in the way adjectives tend to do. All right, so the tenses of the participle. Now the thing to bear in mind is that with Greek tenses, the quality of the action is more important than the relationship, temporal relationship to the main verb, unlike Latin. In Latin, the participles are related to the main verb. But here in the Greek, while some of the realities in Latin are similar, the main concern of the participle tense stem is actually the kind of action it is. So in the case of the present, the present participle, so participles that are using that present stem, the first principal part, they indicate continuous action, repeated action, attempted action. And yes, they're usually contemporaneous with the main verb. But the thing that's more important about the participle is that the kind of action it is. So continuous, repeated, or attempted action. In the future is the one where, okay, you can really say it has to do with contemporaneous, or its relationship temporally to the main verb, mainly because the future participle indicates intention or purpose. And of course, intentions and purpose look forward to something that's after the main verb. So yes, they're subsequent to the main verb, but that's only because the kind of action that the future participle indicates is an intention or a purpose, which has to happen after the main verb. So now, the aorist and the perfect are the most tricky, especially for folks who have Latin, because this is where, again, Greek deviates from Latin. Now the aorist, remember, is always this simple occurrence, completed action, right? It's an action that happens so fast, it's effectively in the past, right? And so when we move out of the indicative into the participles or any other kind of mood, the quality of the action, the instantaneousness of the action is what is paramount when the writer is using it, right? And it's not the fact that the action happened before the main verb. Yes, oftentimes the action is prior to the main verb, but that's not the reason the writer is using the aorist. The writer is using the aorist because he wants to indicate the quality of the action, the instantaneousness, the fact that it's done and complete as soon as it happens. In the case of the perfect, similarly, perfects have to do with the state that results from an action, right? So the perfect then is often a present, because it's the present state that results from a prior action. And so, for example, perfect participles are much more common than the perfect finite form, actually, mainly because the perfect participle is ways in which they talk about things that are consequences of action. So one example would be, the word for exile in Greek, they would use the perfect participle of a verb to mean throw out, ekbalo, say, right? So the exiles will be the perfect participles in the plural of to throw out, right? Because they have been thrown out. Now they're in a state of having been thrown out. They are exiles, right? So that is how the perfect participle tends to work. We'll see that more frequently than we will see something like I am an exile, finite form of the verb. Okay, so that's how the tenses are going to work, right? But also important is the fact that they are adjectives, and so in this respect, the issue of the way adjectives behave, that is, whether they're attributive or predicative, is really, really important to get a handle on. So just as with an adjective where it carries the article, it is attributive. So if you say ho kalos anthropos, ho kalos takes the article, so it's the beautiful man. However, if it doesn't take the article, then it's kalos ho anthropos, say, then it's the man is beautiful. All right, so that's predicative. Well, the same principle applies when we're dealing with participles. So if the participle carries the article, then it is an attributive participle. Now, what happens to participles, which are, remember, verbal, when they are in the attributive position? Well, they can just be like adjectives, right? So here we have hai or kumenai graes. So hai or kumenai graes. So the participle here is taking the article. So it is attributive. So the dancing old women. Okay? And now another way to translate that is the old women who are dancing. So as a relative clause, the old women who are dancing. So it can either be the dancing old women or the old women who are dancing. That is how you can translate this attributive participle. Another example, ho aner ho is el thon, right? Again, the article tells you that this is attributive. So the man who came in. So this is a easy way to do the relative pronoun. So this is as I said, Greek always has options. So they have two options for how to deal with the relative pronoun, right? Or relative clauses. So they can either use a relative clause, or they can use an article, use an article with the participle modifying the same noun, and that gives you a relative clause. And usually it's pretty clear that that's what's going on. Here's another one. Ho prosten arxas strategos. So the general who held office before. Now, again, because the participle can take things that go with verbs, like adverbs. So here, prosten is an adverb modifying arxas. That can also be part of the whole phrase, and you usually put it in attribution to the participle now. So it's in a sandwich situation with the participle. So ho prosten arxas o strategos, the general who had held office, and then the prosten modifies arxas as the time before. Okay. The article, I think I mentioned this just briefly, that also the article with the participle in the attributive position can also just be used as a noun. So if we want to say the dancing girl, we just can say hey orkumene, or the dancing woman, hey orkumene, right? So the article with the participle gives us the noun, and this is what I was talking about when it comes to perfect participles, especially, are used this way to indicate nouns. Ho archon, the archon, the ruler. Again, article plus the participle. ta legomena, the things being said right now, the speech, right? The things being said, ta legomena. Ha pugon, the fugitive, the guy who's fleeing right now, or the defendant, right? Ha pugon. Ha diokun, the pursuer, the plaintiff, the one pursuing the person. And then you can also have these longer situations, of course, because remember in Greek you can just put an article on anything and make it into a noun. So the men who were put to death in the city by the 30, that group of people, we can say hoi en te pole hupo triakonta apothenontes. So apothenontes is your participle. Apothenontes, those who were put to death, or those who died. And then in the city, en te pole hupo triakonta, by the 30, under the power of the 30. Okay? So we can always do that. Use the attributive participle as a noun. And as I said, you're going to see it most commonly with the perfect. Now, what about predicate participles? Well, these are far more common than the ones in the attributive position, and these are circumstantial, so what we call circumstantial participles. So these describe the circumstances under which the noun is involved in an action of the main verb. Very complicated. In other words, it's the staging of the main verb, subordinate clauses. So we can have the predicate participle can be temporal, so you can translate it as when, while, after. It can be concessive, and usually it's marked with kaiper or hos, but although or despite. It can be causal, because or since, and it can be conditional, if. And again, context will dictate whether or not it's one of these options here. We'll see some examples later. Then the next thing is, so we have to have a good understanding of what a subordinate clause actually is. Hopefully, your English grammar is up to snuff, and you're familiar with subordinate clauses in English, because these are the best ways to handle especially circumstantial participles. All right, and so this is a kind of a review of subordinate clauses, and this will be found for reference in Mastronarde Unit 8. All right, so here we have example. The sailor leaves the marketplace. These are just regular sentences, right? The woman and her daughter hug and kiss, these kinds of things. So a compound, that's just a regular simple sentence. Now, a compound sentence consists of two or more independent clauses. So the woman waves and her daughter waves back, two actions, right? Now, but the complex sentence, which is where the circumstantial participles are going to kick in, are when you have some kind of dependent relationship between the main clause and the subordinate or dependent clause. So, and that's where we talked about these circumstances are dependent relationships, right? So when the sailor arrived, they called a meeting. The messenger who came yesterday told a different story. So this is a relative clause. And you can't just have who came yesterday unless it's a question. You can't have that as its own independent sentence in English. So, the boy and his dog. We have, this is a simple sentence with coordinating conjunction, right? We have the city or in the country, again, two coordinating phrases that are coordinated by the conjunction. He knocked, but nobody answered. Again, two independent clauses that are coordinated by conjunction. if he is found guilty, he will pay a huge fine. So we have the subordinate clause, if, and then the main clause, he'll pay a large fine. The truce that was concluded after Cleon died lasted more than 1 year. So here, the truce after Cleon died is the relative clause, and the main clause, it was concluded. So the truce was concluded and lasted more than 1 year. So that was concluded after Cleon died. That's your subordinate clause. The truce lasted more than 1 year. Okay. Now, the most common way that ancient Greek likes to do subordinate clause is with participles. And the way subordinated ideas are handled in Greek is very different than the way it's handled in English and even in Latin. Greek tends to like to pile up the amount of subordinate or circumstantial ideas around the main verb. And it's very, unless a sentence is really, really short, it's almost always the case that there is a participle involved in a sentence. So it's good to have ways of being able to translate your participles in the most sort of fluent, idiomatic English. All right, so circumstantial participles, as I said, can be translated in using a temporal clause expressing the time. So here I've got two examples, one using the present participle from Amy and the other using the aorist participle from erkomai. All right, so ekopse ton dikastein exionta, right? He struck the juryman, ton dikastein, as or when or while he was coming out. And so here we're translating it temporally, and you can always translate temporally. And so the point is that he was in the process of coming out and the subject struck him. And notice that in English it's kind of hard to know who got struck or who is coming out. So he struck the juryman as he was coming out, as he, the subject, was coming out, or he, the juryman. No, it's the juryman, because dikastein is the accusative and we're using the accusative participle. And so here the point is that it's as he was the process of coming out, he got struck. Here, when we use the aorist, pretty much means basically the same thing, only that the idea would be as soon as he came out, he got whacked in the head. So the aorist tends to have that idea of as soon as he did X, the other thing happened. Here another example with fugon and fugon. Here again, it's a nuance. The emphasis is on the process of fleeing. So when he was fleeing, right, while he was fleeing, the foreigners, the Athenians captured him. So while he was running away, in the process of running away, he was captured. Whereas here, with the aorist, it's slightly different in that when he fled, or as soon as he fled, the foreigners, basically, as soon as he got out, he was captured by the Athenians. So the thing is, you have, especially with the temporal translation, you have to ask yourself, what's happening, right? What's going on? So, and the thing is that the reason why I want you to use the temporal, use subordinate clauses, is that you'll get a sense of what's going on. So when you put the participle in a subordinate clause, you translate the participle according to the tense of the participle. So here, our when clause has an aorist, so you translate it as an aorist. Whereas with fugon, you have a present participle, so you translate it as an imperfect, because ongoing action in the past is imperfect, whereas this is a simple action in the past, aorist. So participles can also be concessive, set up a concessive clause, an although clause. And usually it's marked with Kuiper, but not always, so you have to think about the context as you're translating. So, first one, Kuiper nozon, kalapain nozon eistain agoran elte. So although he was ill with a serious disease, he came to the agora. Ton geronta u prodidonta tin polin exebalon. So they drove the old man into exile, although here it's without the Kuiper, although he was not in fact u prodidonta, trying to betray the city. It can also be causal, and here it's usually again marked with hos or hate, but not always. So ton geronta hos prodidonta tein polin exebalon. They drove the man into exile because he was in fact trying to betray the city. Circumstantial particles can also be translated causally, but it's not always marked, but usually it's introduced with hos or hate when they want to be clear that it is a causal participle or participle phrase. So here, example with the same sentence from before, ta geronta hos prodidonta tein polin exebalon. So here it's clear that we want it to be causal. So they drove the old man into exile because he was betraying the city. And here, the next one, using the aorist participle, ta geronta hos prodonta tein polin exebalon. So they drove the old man into exile because he betrayed the city. So again, the issue here is that I want to emphasize that in these causal or subordinate clauses, or any subordinate clause, you're gonna have the subordinate clause, and the verb that the participle represents is translated as if it were the finite form of that verb. Okay. So let's move on to conditional. So again, participles can be translated conditionally. Usually it's marked by there being the main verb being a future or a subjunctive or something like that. And another way it's marked is by the negative. If the participle has u as its negative, as we saw in the previous slide, then it means that the participle represents an indicative. However, in a condition, you're going to use me as the negative, so me echontes here. And so me echontes represents a conditional because you only use me when you're not in the indicative mood. And so now we know that this is a condition. So if we don't have large shields, we will fight easily, or we'll fight easily. So two things telling us that this is conditional. We should translate the participle conditionally. One is the me here, and the other is the future of the verb, machomai. So why it's important to develop idiomatic ways of translating Greek participles is because Greek narrative texts tend to avoid using coordinated series of actions, joining them with kai, and prefer to use more rhetorically complex structures, that especially using circumstantial participles. And then the tendency is to have a whole bunch of circumstantial participles leading up to a finite verb form that is going to be the ultimate climactic action. So for example, then, this is in Mastronardi Unit 27, Exercise 9-5. The English is, the foolish among men let go of things that are nearby and pursue things that are far off. Now, we might be tempted to translate that into Greek using the two finite forms of the verb, to let go and to pursue. But if you wanted to be more idiomatically Greek, you would have to put one of these verbs into the participle. So in other words, Greek prefers to use the participle construction when you have two verbs, even where in English we really can only translate it as two coordinated verbs. So here the Greek prefers then hoi aphrones ton anthropon, and then ta paronta aphentes, so it prefers the participle aphentes, ta aponta dioukusi, over using aphiasi, the finite form of aphiemi, instead. So it absolutely prefers this. So when you have to translate a sentence that has two verbs, right, the two finite forms in English, you really need to ask yourself, okay, which one is the more important verb here? Put that one in the finite form, and then the less important, the one that seems to be background information, that one will be put in the participle. Another example Maserati gives from same unit, but in exercise 1:8. Okay, so the Athenians burned the tents and seized the horses. So two actions here. And so, as I said, Greek will prefer to use participle for one of these verbs rather than saying two verbs in the finite form. So here you have the preferred first, hoi athenaioi taskenas kausantes, the participle to sipus harpasan, over what you might be naturally tending to do in English, translating it into Greek, but this would not be idiomatic Greek. Hoi athenaioi taskenas ekausan tus hippus harpasan. So you have two finite forms. This is less idiomatic for Greek than to throw one of these into the participle. And so here, the more important verb is harpasan. They seized the horses. But notice then, the corollary is the case, right? So if you have a sentence, hoi athenaioi tas skenas kausantes tus hippus harpasan, you can actually legitimately and should, in fact, translate as the Athenians burned the tents and seized the horses, as opposed to some other construction, like having burned the tents, which I don't like, and seized the horses. They seized the horses. So it's much more idiomatic to say they burned the tents and seized the horses. So that is the difference here. Now, the future participle is going to be used to express purpose or intention, right? And so here, and often indicated by hos, but not always. Again, remember, there's options. So here you have pempsas hipeas angeluntes tein nikein. So they sent the cavalrymen to announce the victory, right? So angeluntas is your future participle, and so it is indicating the purpose. Uk elthomen hos to basile polemisantes. So they have not come with the intention of waging war against the king. So again, they didn't come. Uk elthomen. We didn't come. We have not come. Uk elthomen. Hos is used this time to wage war against the king. And oftentimes this is going to be triggered by a verb of motion, where you'll have a verb of motion. They sent somebody to do something, and you'll have the participle will be in the future. So when it comes to negating participles, then it helps to remember that the participles stand in for a verb, right? They stand in for a finite verb that they have made in a subordinate relationship to the main verb. So question is then, what was that original finite verb? And so if the finite verb referred to a fact, a specific event, or an actual occurrence, then you're going to negate the participle with because that, the finite form that the participle represents is an indicative, right? So circumstantial participles, concessive participles, and attributive participles take oo when they are specific, when they refer to specific events and things. So here's an example. Echon kremata hogeron dora oise. So because he doesn't have money, that is, he actually doesn't have any money, right? So that's why it's echon. Because he doesn't have any money, the old man will not bring gifts. Now, the next one. Epe nesamen tus u fugontas en te mache. So we have tus u fugontas, which is our attributive participle, and it's negated by u, which means that this is actual people who fled, right? So we praise those who did not, in fact, actually flee during the battle, and it's a specific battle. Okay, so it's not a generalized thing. Me then is the opposite. So me is going to be used for conditional, generic, anything that you would use outside of the indicative. So if this participle stands for something that wasn't indicative, then you're going to use me. So it can stand for an imperative, right? So you would use me. So me echon kremata, as I used that one before. So if he doesn't have money, the old man will not bring gifts, right? Hoi me fugontes en te mache haloi polita esi. So those who do not flee in battle or in any battle, and this is a generic statement, are fine citizens, right? Ho me nozon, any non-sick person, right? Any man who is not sick, whoever is not sick, right? So me is more generic. All right. Now again, because the participle is a verb, right, then it can do things that verbs do. That is, it can take objects, because if the verb takes an object, then it can take an object. And if it's a copular verb, that is a verb like to be or to become, to seem, etc., then it can also take a predicate noun or predicate adjective. And of course, it then has to agree with whatever the participle, whatever case, number, gender the participle happened to be in. All right, so here's a good example. Hoi pleistoi ton dohunton sophon inai. Right? So hoi pleistoi, the majority of those who, so because notice it's attributive participle, the participle takes the article. So the majority of those who seem, so dohunton means to seem, those who seem inai to be wise. So the wise, sophon, is going to be genitive because we already had the genitive because of pleistoi, partitive genitive, the majority of those who, so that's going to be genitive, and then the matching predicate adjective or noun is going to be in the genitive to match with dokunton. Another one here, the Master gives peithontai to demosthene ho stratego onti. Okay, so they obey peithontai Demosthenes. Now peithontai or peitho takes a genitive or a dative object, right? So they obey Demosthenes, so he's in the dative, to demosthene. And then why? Well, hos strategonti. Here's your participle construction. It's causal, the hos, because he is a general, and onti is mapping onto Demosthenes, which is in a dative, and so also stratego is going to map on to Demosthenes' dative as well. So everything is in the dative because peithontai sets up a dative with Demosthenes, and so participles that modify Demosthenes, just as adjectives that modify Demosthenes, would also be in the dative. Okay. Now, as in Latin, there are absolute constructions. In Latin, you only have the one, the ablative absolute, but in Greek, you've got two. Of course, in Greek, you've got two. Why not? So we've got two absolute constructions. One is a genitive absolute, far more common, the one that sort of maps onto the ablative absolute in Latin, and then you have the accusative absolute. All right, so let us see. The issue here is that when you have this absolute construction, the genitive, the participle, and the noun don't interact, or they're completely separate from the main verb, main clause. So let's see here. Oh yeah, they give So how you set it up? Okay, so you'll have your noun or pronoun in the genitive, and then you'll have your circumstantial participle agreeing with the noun or pronoun in the genitive. That's the formula, right? And the genitive, whether it's the noun or the participle, can't have any other function in the sentence. Okay, so the genitive absolute phrase can also, because it's a circumstantial participle phrase, it can be causal, temporal, concessive, or condition, right? And the most idiomatic way to translate this is with a subordinate clause. So that's what you should be using. Okay, so in our first example, we have tu strategou, so you have your noun in the genitive and your participle fougontos. So this is your genitive absolute. And then hoi stratiotai he autus to basile paradosa. So here we can translate it temporally. After the general fled, right? So because it's fougontos, it's aorist, we're going to translate it as fled. The soldiers surrendered themselves to the king. Okay? Or it could be because the general fled, the soldiers surrendered themselves to the king. So that'd be causal. Or it could be although the general fled, the soldiers surrendered themselves to the king. Concessive. Probably not conditional, but you could say if the general fled, the soldiers surrendered themselves to the king. Right? So any one of those is possible. Now, next one. Here you're using a demonstrative pronoun in the genitive plus your participle here. And that gives you your genitive absolute, right? This being the case, right? Usually with echo plus an adverb gives you the same as st plus an adjective, right? So this being so, right? So this being the case, they made a truce. So because this was the case, they made a truce. Although this was the case, they made a truce. When this was the case, they made a truce. If this was the case, they made a truce. Kind of problematic if it's a condition. Again, you tend to need a future for a condition. Another one, ton gunai kon. Here's your noun in the genitive, followed by ento stratopedo uson, matching participle in the genitive verb to be. So, hoi and Andres kalos makuntai. So here we could translate it conditionally. So if the women are in camp, men will fight well, right? Could be although the women are in the camp, the men will fight well. Because the women are in the camp, the men will fight well, etc. So you can have any one of those possibilities. The larger context of the sentence will give you the appropriate, which is the best translation here. So, but notice that, so whenever we put our participle construction in the clause, then we map on the finite form of the verb to the same tense of the participle. What about the accusative absolute? This one tends to give everybody a lot of trouble, especially when you see it in a text, mainly because you're just not expecting it. One way of in dealing with it is you end up seeing a random neuter participle that you can't figure out what's going on. It might very well be a absolute accusative absolute. So how does that work? So usually you have a circumstantial participle in a neuter singular of an impersonal verb. So like de, cre, existi, these verbs that are usually an impersonal construction. And then with an infinitive, sometimes expressed, sometimes implied, or a noun clause, or sometimes, rarely, with a neuter pronoun. Okay, let's look at an example. So here, very common, deon. So you have deon pathestai with the infinitive here. So deon is your participle, pathestai is the infinitive, right? So it being necessary, or although it's necessary, because it's necessary, if it's necessary. Tois sophois ton phron accusin. They obey the wise. If it's necessary to obey the wise, right? So if it is necessary to obey the wise, or it being necessary to obey the wise, although it is necessary to obey the wise, they pay heed to fools, right? So they listen, accusin, to fools. Now remember, accuo takes a genitive of the source of whatever you're listening to. You're listening to music. Music is an accusative. If you're listening to a man talk about it, then it's in the genitive. Okay. So the source is in the genitive. So this is the genitive of source. Okay. Here's another one. Udes ton kakon ahairestai exon ton agathon. So udes, no one will choose the bad, right? To kakon. Exon, here's your participle, but nothing, it's just by itself there. Exon, when it is possible to choose the good. So XSD, it is possible, plus an infinitive. The infinitive is implied. It's going to come out of hairestai or helestai, right? To choose the good. So no one will choose kakon, the evil, exon, if it is possible, or when it is possible to choose the good. All right. Next one. Alloti doxan ho demosthenes to strateuma apege. So something else had been decided or seemed best. Demosthenes led the army back. So when something else, because something else, although something else had been decided or seemed best, Demosthenes led the army back. Okay, so yeah, so the here it's doxan is your accusative absolute. So again, doche is one of these impersonal constructions, right? Doche, it seemed good or best to do something. Here, exon, XSD, and de on de. So all of these are pretty common in personal verbs, and they can sometimes show up in a circumstantial absolute clause. So you have to watch out for them. They're not as common as the genitive absolute, though. All right, but sometimes you get the accusative absolute used like the genitive absolute, right? And usually this is marked by it being introduced by hos or hos pair. Okay, so here we have humas excitesontai. So they will beg you guys. They will beg you people, you plural, right? And then hos ekenon polon agathon al u polon kakon aition genomenon. Right, so here's your absolute clause. So as if that man were or became or had was, I guess, had been genomenon, had been responsible, IT-on, for many good things and not many bad things. All right? So here, you've got your personal pronoun, it's a demonstrative, and then you have your verb to gignomai in the aorist. So on its own, it said that man had been responsible for many good things and not many bad things. So as if that man had been responsible for many good things and not many bad things, right? As I said, this is going to be less common than the genitive absolute. The genitive absolute is going to be the most common. The impersonal use of the accusative absolute with deon, doxan, exon, verbs like that, crane. These verbs will be, it's possible to see them in the accusative absolute less frequently, and then rarely, but not impossible, you'll get what looks like a genitive absolute, but it's really accusative absolute with hos as the marker. That, okay, this is an accusative absolute. All right, some takeaways then from part 1. Greek prefers to use complex sentences with participial constructions instead of coordinated sentences, right? So what this means is that if you're asked to translate in English a sentence that has X did A and B, right, 2 verbs, then you need to pick one of those verbs as the more important and put the less important verb in the appropriate participle, okay? Because that would be much more idiomatic as far as Greek is concerned, because they really do not like to have 2 verbs that are finite in the same sentence. So that's number 1. Another thing that the corollary of that means that if you're asked to translate an English sentence, or sorry, you're translating a Greek sentence, and you have, it kind of makes better sense to see the 2 verbs as coordinated in English. You can do that, but that's a very rare situation. It's better to then think of the participle as if it's an attributive participle, to treat it as a relative clause and translate it that way, or if it's a circumstantial participle, to decide what kind of circumstantial relationship it is in with the main verb and translate it that way. So that brings us to 2, right? So when translating participles, I really want, at this stage in your career, I want you to translate them as clauses as a relative clause if it's attributive, and as a circumstantial clause if it is a circumstantial participle, right? And what you do is you keep the tense. This is where the tense works, right? So if the tense of the participle is present and your main verb, say, is present, then you're going to keep the participle in that subordinate clause. It's going to be a present. If it's a past tense in the main, then in English we tend to make the circumstantial clause imperfect, right? If it's aorist, then you have it as an aorist in that circumstantial clause. If it's a future, you have it future, etc. So the participle takes on the tense in its circumstantial clause that it had in its participle form. So if it was an aorist participle in the circumstantial English clause, you would translate it as a finite, however you translate that aorist or whatever, okay? So that's the point. That's why I want you guys to avoid using this whole issue of having done whatever, because that, as I said, will lead you not to see what's actually happening here, right? It's better to produce it as a clause, and that way you can see that, okay, here I need the aorist, and to translate an aorist into the simple past. I need to translate this as an imperfect because it's a present participle and I'm in the past tense, etc. Okay? All right, so now the next one, part 2, will deal a little bit more with verbs and that take participles and participles in supplementary situations. Okay.